She said loudly that she had a gift no one ever forgot. The millionaire heard and became restless with that phrase. He smiled and replied, "So, I want to test it." But he didn't imagine the price he would pay for it later. Right here, which part has most piqued your curiosity so far? Your interaction is what keeps this channel alive for you. Activate your subscription, because the ending will thrill you to the core. Marina always knew there was something different about her voice. It wasn't the timbre nor the power, but rather the way she could touch people when she spoke. It was as if each word carried an invisible weight, a vibration that traveled through the air and reached directly into the listener's chest. She herself didn't fully understand this gift, but she knew it had existed since childhood, when she would calm her mother on sleepless nights just by humming softly beside her. She grew up in East London, in the neighbourhood of Penfield, in a narrow 3-story townhouse where she lived with Mrs. Celia, her mother. The house had peeling walls, windows that creaked in the wind, and a small backyard where her mother cultivated herbs and medicinal plants. It was a simple home but full of affection and memories. Marina learned the value of care early on. Her mother had always been frail in health, with a condition that doctors could never precisely diagnose. They said it was fibromyalgia, then spoke of autoimmune problems, but no treatment worked completely. Mrs. Celia lived between crises of intense pain and periods of relative tranquility, and Marina became her caregiver from adolescence. It was while caring for her mother that Marina discovered her true calling. She massaged Mrs. Celia's back while talking, telling stories, singing old songs, and she noticed that when she combined the touch of her hands with the sound of her voice, something magical happened. Her mother relaxed deeply, the pains eased, her body surrendered to a rest that no medicine could provide. Marina began to study on her own, borrowing books from the neighborhood library, watching videos online, reading about massage therapy, breathing, guided meditation. But what she practiced went beyond any formal technique. It was something intuitive, almost mystical. At 23, Marina got her first formal job as a massage therapist at an alternative therapy clinic in the Willow Creek area. On the other side of the city, Harmony Clinic, as it was called, was located in a renovated old mansion with spacious rooms, the smell of incense, and soft background music. The place served a varied clientele, from people with chronic pain to stressed executives seeking a moment of peace amidst the metropolis's hustle and bustle. Marina was initially hired to give relaxing massages, but soon began to develop her own approach. She didn't work only with her hands. During sessions, Marina guided patients through deep breathing exercises, led their minds with gentle verbal commands, and created an atmosphere of complete welcome. Her voice had a hypnotic, almost musical rhythm that made patients enter states of deep relaxation. Some said they felt as if they were floating. Others reported sensations of warmth or tingling in specific areas of the body. There were those who cried without knowing why, releasing emotions that had been repressed for years. What no one knew, not even Marina fully understood, was that she possessed a rare form of auditory synesthesia. When she touched someone's body, she didn't just feel muscle tension or pain points, she also heard them. It was as if each contracted muscle, each locked joint, each blocked emotion produced a specific sound. She heard dissonant notes, hisses, low or high-pitched noises, and instinctively, she modulated her own voice to harmonize with these internal sounds that only she could perceive. It was like tuning a musical instrument, bringing the body back to its natural frequency. Marina's patients began to report surprising improvements. Chronic pains diminished after a few sessions. Insomnia disappeared. Anxiety dissolved. She never promised miraculous cures, never advertised her work, but word of mouth spread. Her room at the clinic always had a full schedule, and there was a growing waiting list. Her work was discreet, almost invisible, yet profoundly transformative. Marina was a woman of simple appearance. She had long brown hair, always tied in a practical bun during work. Her eyes were dark and expressive, capable of conveying compassion without needing words. She wore comfortable clothes, usually in neutral tones, and had a gentle way of moving, as if she were always walking on clouds so as not to disturb the silence around her. She was beautiful in a natural way, without artifice, with a beauty that came more from her tranquil presence than from her physical features. She divided her routine between the clinic and caring for her mother. She woke up early, prepared breakfast for Mrs. Celia, organized her medicines, and made sure everything was in order before taking the bus that took her to Willow Creek. It was almost a 2-hour round trip, crossing the gigantic city, but Marina didn't complain. She used this time to read, listen to podcasts on integrative health, or simply observe people on public transport, imagining the stories each one carried. At the clinic, Marina had colleagues who became friends. There was Julia, the cheerful receptionist who always had a joke to tell, and Felicity, another therapist specializing in acupuncture. The three often had lunch together at the small corner cafe, sharing packed lunches and talking about the day's challenges. It was during one of these relaxed moments, on a Thursday afternoon, that Marina uttered a phrase that would completely change her life. They were in the clinic corridor, waiting for the next patients to arrive. Felicity commented on a difficult patient she had seen that morning, a rigid lady who complained about everything and couldn't relax during the session. Julia laughed and said that Marina had a way with all kinds of people, that she could soften even the most stubborn. Marina shrugged with a shy smile and replied without much thought, "I have an incredible gift with my mouth." The three laughed. Marina continued explaining, gesturing as she spoke, that her technique was entirely based on verbal guidance, guided breathing, and the commands she gave with her voice. That she could make people surrender completely just by the way she spoke to them. Felicity joked that it was almost hypnosis, and Marina agreed that it might indeed be something similar. The conversation continued naturally. The three returned to their respective rooms, and the day continued as any other. What Marina didn't know was that, on the other side of the corridor in the waiting room reserved for VIP clients, a man had heard only that initial phrase, "I have an incredible gift with my mouth." He was sitting in a leather armchair, distractedly flipping through a magazine, when those words reached his ears. Out of context, unaccompanied by the explanation that followed, those words sounded like something completely different, and they sparked in him a strange mix of curiosity, irony, and even a slight scandal. Edward Albright was 42 years old and one of the most well-known figures in the London corporate world. His name frequently appeared in business magazines, on lists of successful entrepreneurs, and on panels discussing leadership and emotional intelligence. He had built an empire from a simple yet revolutionary idea: to create human development programs for large companies, combining coaching techniques, neuroscience, and emotional management. His company, Albright Human Development, was headquartered in a modern building on Regent Street and served clients across the country. Edward was a handsome man with a striking presence. Tall, about 6 feet 1 inch, he had greying hair at his temples. That gave him a mature and trustworthy air. His eyes were grey, penetrating, capable of reading people with almost uncomfortable precision. Always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, he exuded authority and control. But behind this polished facade was a deeply wounded man. 2 years earlier, Edward had lost his wife and young daughter in tragic circumstances he preferred not to recall. The pain of this loss had transformed him into a different person. He closed himself off emotionally, distanced himself from friends, and plunged into work as a form of escape. He stopped sleeping properly, began to have anxiety attacks, and developed chronic tension in his shoulders and neck that worsened over time. 6 months prior, during a business trip, he suffered a severe injury to his right shoulder while trying to lift a heavy suitcase alone. The injury was more serious than it initially seemed. His shoulder locked, the pain became constant and unbearable, and doctors diagnosed a rotator cuff injury with complications that would require surgery and months of physical therapy. Edward refused the surgery. He also refused the numerous treatments offered to him. Physical therapy, acupuncture, injections, increasingly strong medications. Nothing seemed to work. Or perhaps he didn't allow it to work. The truth was that Edward was so hardened inside, so emotionally locked, that his body simply mirrored this state. He began to live secluded in his mansion in Kensington Gardens, an immense and empty house that once housed a happy family and was now just a mausoleum of memories. It was his private doctor, Dr. Henry, who insisted he needed to try something different. That the pains weren't just physical, but had a deep emotional root. That he needed to allow himself to be cared for, to open up to new possibilities. Dr. Henry knew Harmony Clinic and spoke wonders of the therapists there, especially of a young woman who had a unique technique and was performing true miracles with chronic pain patients. Edward agreed to go, more to silence the doctor than to believe anything would change. He arrived at the clinic on Thursday afternoon, at the time reserved for clients who paid for privacy and discretion. He was led to the VIP waiting room, a separate environment from the rest of the clinic, decorated with comfortable sofas, abstract paintings on the walls, and a small water fountain that produced a relaxing sound. He had been there for about 15 minutes when he heard those female voices in the corridor. He heard the laughter. He heard the phrase, "I have an incredible gift with my mouth." For a moment, Edward was disconcerted. He didn't know whether to laugh at the ambiguity or be indignant at the lack of professionalism. But there was something in that voice that intrigued him. It was a voice different from the other two, softer, more musical. There was a quality to it that he couldn't define, but which somehow caught his attention in a way that nothing else had. In recent months, when Julia came to fetch him to lead him to the room where he would be seen, Edward asked who the professional attending him would be. Julia explained it would be Felicity, the acupuncturist. Edward shook his head, and with an authority that brooked no argument, said he wanted to be seen by the other one, the one who had the gift with her mouth. Julia was confused for a second, then understood he must have heard something in the corridor. She explained that Marina was a massage therapist, not an acupuncturist, and that it might not be the most appropriate treatment for his case. Edward insisted. He wanted Marina. Julia went to Marina's room to explain the situation. Marina was finishing organizing her things for the next day, as that would be her last appointment of the afternoon. When she heard there was a VIP client demanding to be seen by her, she was surprised and a little apprehensive. She didn't usually attend to the VIP room. That space was generally reserved for more experienced therapists or those with specific specialties. But Julia said the client had been very insistent and that Roger, the clinic owner, had already authorized it. Marina adjusted her lab coat, took a deep breath, and went to the VIP waiting room to fetch the patient. When she entered the room and her eyes met Edward's, there was a brief moment of silence. She didn't know who he was. She didn't recognize his face from magazines or television. To Marina, he was just another client, a man who looked tired and burdened with tension. She introduced herself in her usual gentle way, extended her hand, and said her name with the calm voice she typically used to make patients feel at ease. Edward shook her hand and felt something strange. Marina's hand was warm, soft, firm, but there was something more, a kind of energy that passed from her touch to him. He mentally reprimanded himself for thinking this way, for attributing mystical sensations to a simple handshake. He followed Marina down the corridor to the treatment room, observing the way she moved, soft and silent, almost as if she floated. The treatment room was a welcoming space, with low lighting, a comfortable massage table in the center, shelves with essential oils and aromatic candles. There was a very low ambient sound, something that sounded like birdsong mixed with running water. Marina asked Edward to sit in the chair next to the massage table and began asking initial questions. What was the reason for the visit? Where was the pain? How long had it been present? Any history of injuries or surgeries? Edward answered objectively, almost mechanically, as if he were reading a medical report. But Marina perceived something more. She always did. As he spoke, Marina observed him carefully. She saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the clenched jaw, the short, shallow breathing. But she also saw the sadness in his eyes, the exhaustion, the invisible weight he carried. She didn't ask personal questions. It wasn't her nature to invade patients' emotional privacy right at the start. But she mentally noted everything she was perceiving. She explained how the session would proceed. It would begin with a guided breathing technique to help him relax. Then she would perform an assessment of his body through touch, identifying points of tension, and she would use a combination of therapeutic massage with verbal guidance to work on these areas. Edward listened with a neutral expression, but inwardly he was skeptical. He had already gone through so many treatments, heard so many promises. Why would this one be different? Marina asked him to lie on the massage table, face up, and close his eyes. Edward obeyed, more out of politeness than expectation. She turned off the main light, leaving only an indirect lamp on, and began. First, she positioned herself beside the massage table, without touching him yet, and began to speak. Her voice was lower, more rhythmic, almost like a song without a melody. She asked him to pay attention to his breathing, to notice the air entering his nostrils, filling his lungs, descending to his abdomen, to perceive the weight of his body against the table, the temperature of his skin, the distant sound of the ambient music. Edward, despite his skepticism, began to pay attention to her words. There was something hypnotic in Marina's voice. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. The rhythm, the cadence, the small silences between phrases. Marina continued guiding his breathing, and slowly Edward felt his body begin to respond. His breathing deepened, his chest rising and falling more fully. She then placed one of her hands lightly on his chest, without pressing, just establishing a point of contact, and she continued speaking, saying that the air he breathed carried calm, that each exhalation carried away tension, that the body knew the path to relaxation and just needed to be reminded of it. That's when it happened for the first time. Marina closed her own eyes for a moment, and upon touching Edward's chest, she began to hear, not with her physical ears, but with that part of her that no one else possessed. She heard a deep, dense sound, almost like a continuous hum. It was the sound of chronic pain, accumulated tension, unprocessed grief. It was a dissonant, out-of-tune sound that caused her a slight discomfort. Instinctively, Marina began to modulate her voice. She adjusted the tone, the frequency, seeking a harmony that could neutralize that internal noise that only she could perceive. Edward, with his eyes closed, felt something inexplicable happen. It was as if her voice was entering his body, reaching places that no massage, no medicine had managed to touch. He felt a wave of warmth course through his chest, then his shoulders descending through his arms. It wasn't a common physical sensation. It was something deeper, almost spiritual. For an instant he thought he was imagining things, that it was just suggestion, a placebo effect. But he couldn't deny what he was feeling. Marina moved her hands to his right shoulder, the injured one. She touched it delicately, feeling the stiffness of the muscles, the inflammation, the body in a defensive posture. And she heard again. This time the sound was sharp, strident, almost painful for her. It was the sound of the physical injury combined with emotional resistance. Marina took a deep breath and began to work. She lightly pressed certain points, made gentle circular movements, and at the same time continued speaking, guiding Edward to imagine his shoulder opening, the muscles releasing, the pain dissolving like salt in water. Edward felt his shoulder throbbing, but it wasn't the usual pain. It was different, as if something was moving inside, reorganizing itself. And then something completely unexpected happened. He felt a lump rise in his throat. He felt his eyes sting. And before he could control it, a tear rolled from the corner of his closed eye. He was mortified. Edward Albright didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the day of the accident, when he lost everything. He had locked himself off emotionally and swore he would never again allow himself this weakness. But there, in that dim room, with that woman's voice enveloping him like an invisible embrace, his defenses began to give way. Marina noticed the tear. She said nothing, made no comment, asked no questions. She simply continued her work with the same delicacy, the same respect. She knew that sometimes the body needed to release what the mind insisted on holding back. That healing was not just physical, but involved deep layers of emotion and memory. She modulated her voice to an even more welcoming maternal tone and continued guiding Edward along an inner path he had forgotten existed. The session lasted an hour. When Marina finally said, with her soft voice, that he could begin to return, to move slowly, to open his eyes in his own time, Edward felt different. He couldn't explain exactly how, but there was a lightness that hadn't been there before. His shoulder still ached, but it was a different pain, milder, less sharp. He sat up on the massage table slowly, blinking to accustom his eyes to the light Marina had turned back on. She stood beside the massage table, a glass of water in her hands, offering it to him. Edward accepted and drank in silence. Marina said it was normal to feel a little disoriented after the session, that the body had worked hard internally, even if outwardly it seemed nothing had happened. She recommended that he drink plenty of water in the next few hours, avoid physical exertion, and try to get a good night's sleep. Edward paid for the session, left a generous tip, and left the clinic without saying much. He got into his chauffeured car and remained silent throughout the drive home. He arrived at the mansion as darkness fell, crossed the enormous hall, ascended the marble staircase, and went straight to his bedroom. He took a long shower, letting the hot water fall over his shoulders, and noticed that the pain was genuinely less. He lay down on the enormous bed, turned off the lights, and for the first time in months, slept deeply, without waking in the middle of the night, without nightmares, without anguish. When he woke the next morning, Edward sat up in bed and experimentally moved his shoulder. There was still pain, but he could move it a little more than before. He stayed there in the silence of the room, processing what had happened the night before. It wasn't just the physical issue, it was something more. That woman, Marina, had touched something within him that he thought was dead. And this simultaneously frightened and deeply intrigued him. He picked up the phone and called the clinic as soon as it opened, asking to schedule another session with Marina. He wanted to know if what he had felt was real or just a moment of weakness. He wanted to understand what she had done. And though he wouldn't admit it to himself, he wanted to be in that dim room again, listening to that voice that seemed to know the way back to his lost humanity. Marina, for her part, arrived home that night with a strange feeling in her chest. There was something different about that patient. She had attended to hundreds of people, each with their pains and stories. But Edward was different. There was a depth in him, a pain so ancient and rooted that she could almost hear it even hours after the session. She prepared dinner for her mother, helped Mrs. Celia bathe and lie down, and then sat by the bedroom window looking at the city lights in the distance. She didn't know yet, but that encounter was the beginning of a transformation that would change both their lives. That the phrase spoken without thought, the misunderstanding that brought Edward to her, was actually the start of a journey that would take them to emotional places neither of them imagined having the courage to visit again. And that, in some mysterious way, fate was weaving a story that involved past, present, and a connection that went far beyond what anyone could foresee. The sessions became a routine. Edward called the clinic at the beginning of each week, scheduling his appointments always in the late afternoon, always in the VIP room, always with Marina. She never asked why he insisted on coming at that specific time, but she perceived an almost obsessive need in the regularity of these encounters. 3 times a week, promptly at 5 in the afternoon, Edward arrived at Harmony Clinic in his black chauffeured car, ascended the steps of the old mansion, and silently proceeded to the reserved waiting room. Marina began to learn the patterns of his body. With each session, she identified small changes, subtle improvements. His shoulder was responding in a way no doctor had predicted. The range of motion gradually increased. The acute pain gave way to a more bearable discomfort, and the stiffness began to yield. But Marina knew it wasn't just the physical work that was affecting this transformation. It was something deeper, something happening in the invisible layers of the human being, where emotion and body meet and intertwine. During the 3rd session, something different happened. Marina was working on Edward's shoulders, with him lying, face down on the massage table, when she began to lead a visualization exercise. She asked him to imagine his shoulder as a river that had been dammed, and now the floodgates were slowly opening, allowing the water to flow again. She asked him to visualize energy circulating freely, carrying nutrients, carrying oxygen, carrying life to that region that had been forgotten and abandoned. Edward followed her instructions, eyes closed, surrendered to that voice that seemed to have power over him. And suddenly, without warning, a memory emerged. It wasn't a common recollection. something he could choose to remember or not. It was a visceral memory, emerging from the depths of his being like an air bubble from the dark depths of a lake. He saw himself as a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, running in a green field, with the sun on his face. There was a woman in the distance waving to him, calling him back home. The image was so vivid, so real, that for a moment Edward didn't know if he was in the clinic or in that childhood field. And then, uncontrollably, he began to cry. It wasn't a restrained, discreet cry. It was a deep, convulsive sob that shook his entire body. It came from a place that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it existed. Marina felt his body trembling under her hands. She didn't stop what she was doing, didn't ask questions, didn't try to interrupt the process. She just kept touching, kept speaking with that soft voice, saying it was okay, that he could let it out, that this was a safe place. Edward cried for several minutes. He cried for the wife he lost, for the daughter he would never see grow up, for the life that was brutally interrupted. He cried for the child he once was, free and happy, before the world taught him to be tough. He cried for all the times he held back tears, swallowed pain, forced himself to be strong when all he really wanted was to fall apart. When the crying finally subsided, giving way to gasping, exhausted breaths, Edward felt strangely light, as if he had shed a weight he had carried on his back for years. Marina gave him time. She waited for him to compose himself at his own pace. When he finally opened his eyes and sat up on the massage table, his eyes still red and swollen, she was there offering him water, offering him a tissue, offering him a silent and welcoming presence. Edward looked at her and for the first time truly saw her. Not as a therapist, not as a clinic employee, but as a human being who had witnessed his deepest fragility and didn't judge him for it. "Thank you," was all he managed to say, his voice hoarse and broken. Marina smiled softly. "No need to thank me. The body knows what it needs to do to heal. I just help open the pathways." Edward left that session transformed. He didn't go straight home. He asked his driver to stop at a nearby park and walked alone for almost an hour, processing what had happened. He felt vulnerable, yet at the same time more alive than he had felt in years. There was something about that woman, that Marina with her soft voice and miraculous hands, that was unearthing parts of him he had buried. And he didn't know if this was good or dangerous. Weeks passed and the relationship between Marina and Edward deepened, though always within professional boundaries. They didn't talk much during sessions. It wasn't necessary. Communication happened in other ways, through touch, through her voice, through shared silence, through synchronized breathing. Marina never asked about his personal life, and Edward offered no information, but she knew by the way his body responded, by his deep sighs, by occasional tears, that there was a story of pain there, a loss that had broken him in half. Edward, in turn, began to observe Marina more closely. He noticed the small details, the way she always arrived exactly on time, never late. The care with which she prepared the room before each session, adjusting the light, choosing the essential oil of the day, checking that the temperature was pleasant. The dedication with which she treated not only him, but all patients. Once he arrived early and saw Marina saying goodbye to an elderly lady at the clinic door, carrying her bag, helping her down the steps with infinite patience. There was genuine kindness in her, something rare to find. One day Edward arrived at the session more tense than usual. He had had a difficult week at work, with financial problems in the company, tough decisions to make, employees to dismiss. He was carrying all that tension in his body, especially in his back and neck. Marina noticed it as soon as he entered the room. She didn't need him to say anything. She saw it in his rigid posture, his clenched jaw, his distant gaze. She adapted the session accordingly. She worked longer on his back, used deeper myofascial release techniques, and led breathing exercises that helped discharge accumulated adrenaline. And throughout the process she hummed softly. It wasn't exactly singing, it was more like a vocalization, a continuous sound that varied in pitch as she moved her hands over his body. Edward noticed this and was intrigued. He asked what it was, Marina explained for the first time in all those weeks a little about her technique. She said she used her voice as an instrument of healing, that she believed each body had a natural frequency, and that when this frequency was disharmonious, whether due to pain, trauma, or tension, she could perceive it and help realign it using her own voice. Edward wanted to ask more, but Marina delicately changed the subject, refocusing on the session. She didn't like to talk much about her gift. She was afraid people would think it was charlatanism, or worse, that they would try to rationalize something that was fundamentally intuitive and mysterious. But that conversation stayed in Edward's mind. He began researching sound therapy, healing frequencies, synesthesia. He was fascinated by what he discovered. There were scientific studies on how certain sound frequencies could affect the human body, influence brain waves, reduce pain, and promote cellular regeneration. There were reports of people with synesthesia who saw sounds as colors, or who felt textures when they heard music. Did Marina have some variation of this? Could she really hear what was happening in his body? Meanwhile, at the clinic, things began to change for Marina. Her work was attracting attention. Roger, the owner of Harmony Clinic, was impressed with the results she was achieving. Patients specifically returned to book with her. The clinic's online reviews frequently mentioned her name, and some even traveled from other cities for a session with Marina. Roger began to consider increasing the fee for her sessions, turning her into a kind of premium therapist for the establishment. Marina didn't handle this attention well. She hadn't entered this field seeking fame or recognition. Her genuine desire was to help people, alleviate suffering, and make a difference in the lives of those in pain. The idea of being turned into a product, a luxury commodity, made her uncomfortable. But at the same time, she needed the money. Mrs. Celia's medicines were expensive, bills kept piling up, and she dreamed of being able to provide more comfort for her mother, perhaps even hiring a caregiver to share the daily duties with her. It was in this context that the first sign of trouble occurred. One of Marina's regular patients, a middle-aged man named Reginald, had developed a kind of emotional dependence on the sessions. He started showing up without an appointment, tried to extend conversations after sessions, and asked increasingly intrusive personal questions. Marina tried to maintain professional boundaries, but Reginald didn't respect them. One day he tried to invite her to dinner, saying he felt there was a special connection between them. Marina gently refused, explaining that she didn't have that kind of relationship with patients. Reginald was offended. He felt rejected and humiliated, and the following week he cancelled all future sessions and left a negative online review saying that the therapist had given confusing signals, that she flirted during sessions but then rejected advances. The review was obviously malicious and unfounded, but it caused discomfort at the clinic. Roger called Marina to talk, assured her he believed her, but asked her to be more careful with professional boundaries. Marina left that meeting feeling wronged. She had done nothing wrong, never crossed any lines, always been completely professional. But apparently her natural kindness, her welcoming voice, the care she showed, could be misinterpreted by some people. For the first time she questioned whether she should perhaps be colder, more distant. But that went against her nature. She didn't know how to be a therapist in any other way than by fully dedicating herself to the act of caring. Julia and Felicity tried to console her, saying she shouldn't change anything, that patient was clearly someone with trouble understanding boundaries. But Marina was shaken, and that afternoon when Edward arrived for his session, she was visibly different, more withdrawn, less present, with a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Edward noticed immediately. Even before they entered the room, he asked if everything was all right. Marina gave an automatic smile. Anne said yes, she was just tired, but Edward wasn't foolish. He had spent years studying body language, micro-expressions, signs of emotional discomfort. It was his job, and he knew Marina was lying. During the session, she did her work with the same competence as always, but something was missing. The magic wasn't there. The connection was fragile. At the end of the session, as Edward was preparing to leave, he did something he had never done before. He asked directly what had happened. Marina hesitated, but something in his sincere manner of asking made her open up. She told him about the patient who had felt rejected, about the malicious review, about the meeting with Roger. She spoke with a vulnerability she rarely showed, letting him see how much it had hurt her. Edward listened in silence, with a serious expression. When she finished speaking, he said something that surprised her. "You did nothing wrong, and anyone with an ounce of discernment can see that. Don't let an insecure idiot take your essence from you. It's precisely this dedication, this genuine presence that makes you who you are. The world already has enough cold and distant therapists. Don't become another one." Marina felt her eyes well up with tears. No one had ever defended her work, her way of being, with such conviction. She thanked him with a nod, not trusting her own voice to speak. Edward left the clinic with a strange feeling in his chest. Something was growing there, something that went beyond the therapist-patient relationship. He was starting to care about Marina as a person, not just as a professional, and that was dangerous territory. In the following days, Edward couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He, who lived secluded in his mansion, avoiding human connections, was genuinely concerned about a woman he had known for only a few weeks. He decided to do something. He used his contacts to find out more about the negative review. He discovered that Reginald had a history of inappropriate behavior with other health professionals, having already been warned in other clinics. Edward, without saying anything to Marina, spoke with Roger. He didn't use his weight or influence in an intimidating way, but simply presented the facts, suggested that the clinic should better protect its therapists, and offered to help create a more effective safety protocol. Roger was impressed by Edward's interest and agreed to review the clinic's policies. The negative review was officially responded to, clarifying the misunderstanding and reaffirming Marina's integrity. It was not removed, as that would be against the platform's rules, but it was contextualized in such a way that any reader could understand what had truly happened. Marina only learned about this weeks later, when Julia casually mentioned that it had been the VIP client, the one who always booked with her, who had helped resolve the situation. Marina was stunned. Edward had done that for her. Why? She barely knew him. They hardly spoke beyond what was strictly necessary for sessions. Why would he go to the trouble? In the next session, Marina thanked him. Edward shrugged, as if it were nothing, and said he had merely done what any decent person would do. But Marina knew that wasn't true. Few people genuinely cared enough to act. That gesture touched something deep within her, and, without realizing it, her way of looking at Edward changed. He was no longer just a patient. He was someone who had stood by her when she needed him. The sessions continued, but now there was an additional layer of intimacy between them. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't physical. It was something more subtle. It was the recognition that they were two wounded people, each in their own way, trying to find a path back to life. Edward was learning to feel again, to allow himself to be vulnerable, to trust that not every human connection would end in loss. Marina was learning that her work had value, that she didn't need to diminish herself, that there were people who saw her beyond the surface. One day Edward arrived at the clinic with surprising news. He had consulted his orthopedic doctor, Dr. Henry, for new shoulder examinations. And the results were almost inexplicable. The injury that should have required surgery was healing on its own. The inflammation had drastically reduced, the muscles were regenerating, and what was most impressive was that mobility was returning at a rate that made no medical sense. Dr. Henry was perplexed. He asked what Edward was doing differently. Edward replied that he was just doing therapy at Harmony Clinic. The doctor asked to meet the therapist. He wanted to understand what kind of technique was being applied. Edward was in a delicate position. He didn't want to expose Marina, didn't want her to become an object of scientific study, or for her technique to be dissected and analyzed until it lost its magic. But at the same time, he knew that this kind of evidence could help other people, could give legitimacy to her work. He spoke with Marina about it. She was scared by the idea. She didn't know how to explain what she did in a way that made scientific sense. Everything was intuition. It was something that came from within, that couldn't be mechanically reproduced. Edward understood her resistance, and assured her he wouldn't pressure her, that the decision was entirely hers. But he planted a seed. What if she could help more people? And if there was a way to validate her work without losing its essence? Marina took that question home. She spoke with Mrs. Celia, who was having a good day, lucid and present. Her mother listened to everything attentively and said something simple but profound. "Daughter, your gift is not yours. It was given to you to be shared. Don't be afraid to let the world see what you are capable of doing. Trust." Those words echoed in Marina's head. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe it was time to step out of the shadows, to embrace what she was capable of doing, not to be ashamed of her gift. But there was still fear. Fear of being exposed, of being judged, of being misunderstood. The world was not always kind to what it didn't understand, and it was precisely at this moment of doubt and questioning that her life began to unravel in a way she could never have foreseen. All because of that phrase, that damned phrase she had said without thinking, in a moment of relaxation. "I have an incredible gift with my mouth." The phrase that had brought Edward to her, but which would now return like a ghost to haunt her. Reginald, the patient who had felt rejected, was not satisfied with how things had ended. He wanted revenge, and he discovered a cruel way to get it. He had recorded, that day in the corridor, the conversation between Marina and her colleagues. He only had the audio, but it was enough. He edited the file to leave only the initial phrase, cutting out all the explanation that came after. And he posted it on social media with a suggestive and malicious caption. The video went viral. In a few days it was being shared thousands of times. People took the phrase completely out of context, made crude jokes, created vulgar memes. Harmony Clinic's name appeared in the video and began to receive negative comments, calls from people asking inappropriate questions. The situation spiraled completely out of control. Roger panicked. The clinic's reputation was at stake. He knew Marina was not to blame, but the pressure was enormous. Sponsors threatened to withdraw support. Other therapists at the clinic were uncomfortable with the association. In a decision he himself knew was unfair, Roger called Marina and told her he would have to dismiss her, at least temporarily, until things calmed down. He offered severance pay, apologized repeatedly, but the decision was made. Marina left the clinic in shock. She couldn't process what had just happened. Her entire life was crumbling because of a phrase spoken without malice, because of one person's wickedness, because of a world that was too quick to judge and too slow to understand. She took the bus back home with her eyes full of tears, feeling exposed, humiliated, destroyed. When she arrived home, Mrs. Celia immediately noticed something was wrong. Marina told her everything, between sobs, and her mother hugged her with all the strength her frail body allowed. They stayed there, sitting on the old sofa in the living room as night fell outside, and the world seemed to have become a cruel and unjust place. Marina didn't know what to do. She no longer had a job, had no way to pay the bills, didn't know how to rebuild her reputation. She felt lost, defeated, alone, but she wasn't alone, though she didn't know it. Yet someone was about to appear at her door. Someone who wouldn't let her face it without support. Someone who, without realizing it, had become much more important in her life than either of them was ready to admit. Edward discovered what had happened when his assistant, Marcus, showed him the viral video. Marcus thought it was just an internet joke, another one of those silly pieces of content people shared without thinking. But when Edward saw the image, he immediately recognized the corridor of Harmony Clinic, and he recognized the voice, Marina's voice. He watched the entire video, read the disgusting comments, saw the degrading memes. He felt a rage he hadn't felt in years, a profound indignation that made his blood boil. It was a cowardly attack, a cruel distortion of something completely innocent. He knew Marina well enough to know she would never intentionally say anything vulgar, and even if she did, what was the problem? Why did people take such pleasure in destroying someone's reputation? He tried to call the clinic, but no one answered. It was late at night. He thought about waiting until the next day, but something inside him said he couldn't wait. Marina must be devastated. He knew what it was like to be exposed, judged, misunderstood. He didn't want her to face that alone. He asked his driver to take him to the clinic. When he arrived, the place was closed and dark. Edward stood in front of the gate, unsure what to do. That's when he saw Julia coming out a side door. She had stayed late organizing paperwork. Edward called out to her, and Julia recognized the VIP client. He asked about Marina, if she was okay, what had happened. Julia, who had a good heart and was indignant about everything, told him the truth, that Roger had dismissed Marina earlier that day, that the young woman had left completely devastated. Edward asked if Julia knew where Marina lived. Julia hesitated. That was confidential employee information. But there was something in Edward's urgency, in the genuine concern in his eyes that made her trust him. She wrote down the address on a piece of paper and handed it to him. Edward asked the driver to take him to Penfield. The journey was long, crossing the city from one end to the other. They left the affluent Willow Creek area, passed through the city centre, crossed East London until they reached that peripheral neighbourhood where Marina lived. The driver was confused by the unusual destination, but asked no questions. Edward looked out the window, watching the city change around him. Wide, tree-lined streets gave way to congested avenues, then to narrow alleys, houses crammed together, popular shops, people on the street, even though it was late. When they arrived at the address, Edward asked the driver to wait and went up to the door alone. It was a simple townhouse with a front gate worn paint. He rang the doorbell and waited. It took a while for Marina to answer through the intercom. When she heard his voice asking if he could come in, she remained silent for a long moment. She was in her pajamas, her face swollen from crying, completely unprepared to receive visitors, much less him. But something in Edward's voice made her open the gate. He climbed the small staircase leading to the main door, and when Marina opened it, the two stood there, looking at each other. Edward saw her state, her red eyes, her defeated posture, the fragility etched in every feature, and without much thought, without asking permission, he simply embraced her. It was a firm, comforting hug that said everything words couldn't. Marina, who had been holding everything inside, finally allowed herself to collapse. She cried on his shoulder, letting all the pain, all the injustice, all the humiliation pour out in tears. Mrs. Celia appeared in the living room, leaning on a cane, wanting to know who the visitor was. Edward politely introduced himself, explained that he was Marina's patient at the clinic and had come to see if she was all right. Mrs. Celia, with that intuition mothers have, sensed there was something more there. She noticed it in the way he looked at her daughter, in the delicacy with which he had embraced her. She invited him in, offered coffee, and tried to bring a little normality to that surreal moment. The three sat in the small living room. Marina was mortified by the simple house, the old furniture, the stark difference between her life and Edward's. But he showed no discomfort. He sat on the worn sofa as if it were the most luxurious room in the world and spoke with Mrs. Celia with genuine respect and interest. He asked about her health, how she met Marina, about life in that neighbourhood. And Mrs. Celia, charmed by the elegant and attentive man, told stories about her daughter, how she had always been special, always had that gift for caring for people. It was during this conversation that something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Celia got up to fetch more coffee, and Edward offered to help her. She accepted, and the two went to the small kitchen. As Mrs. Celia prepared the coffee, she began to tell old stories of when Marina was a child, of when they went through hardships but always had each other. And then casually she mentioned that they had once lived in an even worse situation, that there was a time when they stayed in a social shelter for a few months after they lost their home in a fire. Edward felt something strange upon hearing that. A social shelter? He asked when it had been. Mrs. Celia thought and said it was about 15 years ago, perhaps. Edward felt his heart quicken. 15 years ago, he had gone through one of the worst moments of his life. Before building his empire, before becoming the successful man, he had suffered a devastating crisis. A panic attack so severe it incapacitated him for weeks. His partners had abandoned him, his company was failing, he didn't even have money to eat. And on one particularly difficult night, when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he ended up in a social shelter in East London. Edward vaguely remembered that time. He was so immersed in despair that many memories were hazy, but there was one thing he never forgot: the voice of a woman who worked at the shelter, who saw his state and sat beside him all night just talking, calming him, telling him everything would pass. He didn't remember her face. It was dark, and his vision was blurry with tears. But he remembered her voice, that soft maternal voice that brought him back from the abyss. Edward looked at Mrs. Celia carefully. There was something familiar about her, but he couldn't be sure. He asked, his voice trembling, which shelter she had worked at. Mrs. Celia mentioned the name. It was the same one. Edward felt his legs weaken. He asked if she remembered a young man completely lost who appeared there. One winter night 15 years ago, a man who was having a panic attack and whom she helped. Mrs. Celia stopped what she was doing and looked at Edward more closely. Her eyes, still sharp despite her age and illness, studied his face. And then, slowly, she began to remember. She remembered a young man in a torn suit, disheveled hair, desperate eyes. A young man who was so close to the edge that she was afraid he would do something drastic. She sat with him that night, talked, made tea, hummed old songs. She stayed there until he calmed, down until he could sleep, and the next day when he woke up, the young man had already left. She always wondered what had happened to him. "You," Mrs. Celia whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. "It was you." Edward couldn't hold back. He began to cry. There in that tiny kitchen, in the simple house of that woman who barely had the means to care for herself, he discovered that his salvation from 15 years ago was connected to his present healing. Mrs. Celia was the woman who had saved him when he was at rock bottom, and Marina was her daughter, heir to that same gift of caring, healing, and bringing people back from darkness. Marina, hearing the commotion in the kitchen, came to see what was happening. She found Edward and her mother embracing, crying, and understood nothing. They had to sit down and explain everything. The story of the shelter, of the night Mrs. Celia helped Edward, of the impossible connection that fate had woven between them. Marina couldn't believe it. It was too surreal, too perfect to be a coincidence. But there it was, living proof that something greater was at work, something beyond what any of them could comprehend. Edward looked at Marina with a new intensity. It was no longer just gratitude for the therapeutic treatment. It was an existential, profound gratitude for her being who she was, for carrying that legacy of kindness her mother had planted. He felt at that moment that his entire life, all the pains, all the losses, all the victories, had been paths to lead him there, to that house, to that family, to that connection. They talked late into the night. Edward told his complete story, something he had never done with anyone. He spoke about the crisis that almost destroyed him, about how he used that experience to build his human development company, about how he met his wife, about the happiness he had and then lost, about how he got stuck in a pain that seemed incurable until he heard that phrase in the clinic corridor and something inside him told him to give it a chance. Marina also opened up. She spoke about growing up caring for her mother, about discovering her gift, almost by accident, about the fear of being different, of not being taken seriously, about the frustration of seeing that, even doing everything right, even genuinely helping people, she could still be destroyed by malice and misunderstandings. Mrs. Celia listened to everything, proud of her daughter, grateful for that man whom fate had brought back to them. When Edward finally prepared to leave, it was already past 2 in the morning. He stopped at the door and said something that would change everything. "I won't let you face this alone. I'll find a way to clear your name, to get justice. And more than that, I want to make you a proposal that could change your life." Marina looked at him, confused. Edward explained that he had been thinking for some time about expanding his business, about creating something new, a space dedicated to holistic healing, where body, mind, and emotions would be treated in an integrated way, a place that combined what he knew about human development with truly effective therapeutic techniques, like the work Marina did, and he wanted her to be the lead therapist, the central piece of this new project. Marina remained silent. It was too much information to process in one night. The discovery of the connection to the past, the job proposal, the possibility of a new beginning. She said she needed to think, that she couldn't make such a decision at that moment. Edward understood perfectly and said there was no rush, that she could take all the time she needed. But before leaving, he made sure to make one thing clear. What he was offering wasn't charity, it was a partnership. It was recognition that she had something valuable, something the world needed, and he wanted to be part of bringing that to the world. In the following days, while Marina thought about the proposal, Edward began to act. He used his contacts in the digital world to trace the origin of the malicious video. He discovered that it had been Reginald who posted and spread it. With the help of specialized lawyers, Edward was able to identify that the video had been deceptively edited, purposely removing context, which constituted defamation. He initiated legal proceedings against Reginald and against the platforms that allowed the dissemination of the content without verification. At the same time, Edward used his influence to tell the real story. He made a long post on his social media, which had millions of followers, explaining what had truly happened. He didn't mention Marina's name directly, but he told the story of an exceptional therapist who was being unfairly attacked because of a phrase taken out of context. The post went as viral as the original video had. People began to understand what had happened, and the tide of public opinion began to turn. Marina watched all this somewhat dazed. She saw her name now being mentioned in positive contexts, saw people apologizing for having shared the video without understanding, saw digital influencers using the case as an example of how cruel and hasty the internet could be. Roger from Harmony Clinic called to apologize and said she could return whenever she wanted. But Marina already knew she wouldn't go back. That chapter of her life had closed. She spoke at length with Mrs. Celia about Edward's proposal. Her mother was wise in her advice. She said that Marina was afraid to dream big, that she had always settled for little because she thought she didn't deserve more. But now, an opportunity was being offered to truly make a large-scale difference, to build something significant, and that she shouldn't let fear stop her. Marina decided to accept the proposal. She called Edward and arranged a meeting at his mansion in Kensington Gardens to discuss the details. When she arrived at that immense house, she was intimidated for a moment. It was a completely different world from hers. But Edward received her with the same kindness as always and took her to his private office. There, he showed her the projects he had begun to develop: models, architectural plans, design concepts. He wanted to transform an entire wing of the mansion into an integrative therapy center. Specialized rooms for different types of treatment, a therapeutic garden, meditation spaces, even a small theater for group sessions. And most impressively, he wanted part of the services to be free, aimed at low-income individuals who would never have access to this type of treatment. Marina was moved to see all that. She saw there not just a business project, but a life project, a way to honor her mother's legacy, to multiply her gift, to do exactly what she had always wanted to do, but never had the resources for. She sat with Edward, and the two spent hours discussing every detail, every aspect of the center's operation. Marina suggested including other therapists, not just her. She wanted it to be a truly collaborative space, where different techniques and approaches could coexist and complement each other. Edward agreed with everything. He was impressed by her vision, by her generosity. Even after all she had been through, Marina held no grudges, didn't want exclusivity. She wanted to share, to include, to do things well. That was precisely why he was certain she was the right person for that project. They decided to call the Space Harmony Institute, a tribute to the clinic where everything began, but also a symbol that the goal was to bring harmony, balance, true healing. They formed a partnership where Edward would provide the capital, infrastructure, and administrative management, while Marina would be the therapeutic director, responsible for all technical aspects and the training of other professionals. But before everything could begin, there was an important detail that needed to be resolved. Edward wanted Marina to get to know the mansion better, especially a room that had been locked for years. A room he hadn't entered since losing his family. It was his daughter's bedroom, and next to it, a small office his wife used. He had locked those doors on the day of the tragic events, and never again had the courage to open them. Edward knew that to truly move forward, to create this new project with the right energy, he needed to make peace with the past. And something inside him said he needed Marina by his side for this, not necessarily as a therapist, but as a witness, as someone who understood deep pain and knew how to respect the healing process. He led Marina to the second floor of the mansion, down a corridor that was separate from the other areas. At the end of the corridor were two doors side by side, both locked. Edward had the keys in his pocket, but his hands trembled as he tried to put them in the lock. Marina placed her hand over his gently and said with that voice he knew so well, "In your own time. No need to force anything. Your body knows when you're ready." Edward took a deep breath. He remembered all the therapy sessions where Marina had said the same thing, where she had patiently waited for him to find his own rhythm. He turned the key and opened the first door, his daughter's bedroom. The room was exactly as it had been left. Toys scattered, books on the shelf, a small bed with princess sheets. Dust covered everything, giving the space a ghostly air. But for Edward, it was like stepping back in time. He entered slowly, touching the objects, remembering. Marina stayed by the door, giving him space, but present if he needed her. Edward sat on the small bed and began to speak. He talked about his daughter, about how funny, smart and full of life she was, about the plans they had for the future, the trips they would take, the things she would learn, about how all of it was ripped away from him in an instant, without warning, without a chance to say goodbye. And then he cried. He cried as he hadn't cried since that terrible day. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the desperate cry of someone who couldn't accept reality. It was the cry of someone who was finally allowing the pain to flow, allowing the memory to exist without being suffocating. Marina approached and sat beside him on the small bed, placing a hand on his stomach, offering silent presence. After a while, when the tears subsided, Edward got up and went to the other room, his wife's office. It was even more untouched, papers on the desk, pens, and empty glass, as if the person could return at any moment. Edward approached the desk and saw something he hadn't noticed the last time he was there, a partially open drawer. He opened it completely and found a notebook inside. It was his wife's diary. Edward picked up the notebook with trembling hands. He had never read it, never wanted to invade her privacy even after everything. But now something told him he needed to. He sat in the office chair and began to leaf through it. There were entries about daily life, about their daughter, about him. And in the last entry, written the day before the events, there was something that made him freeze. His wife wrote about how grateful she was for the life they had, about how Edward was a good man who deserved to be happy, and that if anything happened to her, she wanted him to know that her greatest wish was for him to find the strength to continue, to live fully, to not lock himself in pain. It was as if she knew, as if she had left that message specifically for him to find when he was ready. Edward read those words once, twice, 3 times, and he felt something release within him. The guilt he carried, the feeling of betraying their memory by moving on, all of it began to dissolve. She had given permission. She had asked him to live. He showed the diary to Marina, who read it with tears in her eyes. It was so beautiful, so generous, so full of true love. Marina said something Edward would never forget. She loved you so much that her last thought was about your happiness. Honor that love by living. There is no greater betrayal than wasting the life she so desperately wanted you to enjoy. Edward embraced Marina, and in that moment something changed between them. It was no longer just a therapist-patient relationship or partners in a project. It was a deep friendship, built on shared vulnerability, on mutual healing, on the recognition that both had been instruments in each other's salvation. The following months were a whirlwind of changes. The mansion in Kensington Gardens, which for years had been a silent mausoleum of memories, transformed into a noisy, vibrant construction site. Architects, engineers, decorators, all came and went with blueprints, material samples, ideas for approval. Edward was energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had purpose again, something to build that went beyond profit, that touched something deeper and more significant. Marina divided her time between overseeing the construction and studying. Edward had insisted that she take management and administration courses so she could confidently run the institute. At first, she resisted, thinking she wasn't suited for it, that her gift was working with her hands and voice, not with papers and numbers. But Edward was patient, explaining that for her gift to reach the maximum number of people, She also needed to understand the practical side of things. Marina accepted and was surprised to discover she had an aptitude for it. Her natural organization, her attention to detail, her ability to listen and understand people all translated well to the world of management. Mrs. Celia followed everything with immense pride. Her health had improved somewhat, perhaps due to the joy of seeing her daughter finally getting the recognition she deserved, or perhaps due to the better treatments they could now afford. Edward had insisted on hiring the best doctors to care for her, arguing that it was the least he could do for the woman who had saved him years ago. Mrs. Celia initially tried to refuse, not wanting to be a burden on anyone, but Marina convinced her that accepting help was not weakness, but wisdom. It was during this period of construction that Marina began to develop what would become the heart of the Harmony Institute, her own therapeutic method that combined everything she had learned. Over the years, with new techniques she was studying, she called it vocal resonance therapy, a name Edward helped her coin. The method involved not only the massage and verbal guidance she already practiced, but also specific vocalization exercises where patients themselves learned to use their voices as instruments of self-healing. Marina was excited about the possibilities. She wanted to teach others to do what she did, or at least part of it. She knew that auditory synesthesia was unique to her, that she could never fully replicate that ability, but she believed that the principles behind her work could be taught, systematized, transformed into something other therapists could apply. Edward observed her creative process with admiration. He saw Marina gaining confidence, taking her place as an expert, leaving behind the shyness that characterized her. She began giving lectures at integrative health events, sharing her experiences and insights. At first she was nervous, but over time she found her voice in this context as well, and people listened attentively, fascinated by the combination of science and intuition she presented. It was at one of these lectures that Marina met Dr. Paul Marshall, a renowned neuroscientist who became deeply interested in her work. He approached her after the presentation and asked to talk. He said he had researched cases of synesthesia for years and that what Marina described was an extremely rare and scientifically valuable variation. He asked if she would agree to participate in a study, to allow her brain to be mapped, for her abilities to be properly documented. Marina was apprehensive. She was afraid of becoming a guinea pig, of having her gift dissected and turned into cold data. But Dr. Paul was respectful, explaining that the goal was not to exploit but to understand and document, so that in the future other professionals could develop techniques inspired by that approach. Edward advised Marina to consider it, arguing that it could give scientific legitimacy to her work, protecting her from future accusations of charlatanism. After much reflection, Marina agreed to participate in the study. She underwent a series of examinations, functional MRIs, cognitive tests, sessions where her brain activity was monitored while she worked with patients. The results were extraordinary. Marina's brain truly functioned differently when she was in a therapeutic session, auditory areas activated in synchronicity with tactile and emotional areas, creating a unique neural network. It was scientific proof that what she did was not imagination or a placebo effect, but a real and measurable neurological capacity. Dr. Paul published the results in a prestigious international scientific journal, preserving Marina's identity under a pseudonym to protect her privacy. The article caused a sensation in academic circles. Researchers worldwide wanted to know more, wanted to replicate studies, wanted to understand how that type of synesthesia could be therapeutically applied. Marina suddenly found herself at the center of scientific attention, something she had never imagined. Meanwhile, the Harmony Institute was nearing completion. The transformed wing of the mansion was simply stunning. Each room had been designed with maximum comfort and therapeutic functionality in mind. There were rooms with different atmospheres, some darker and cozier for deep work, others brighter and more open for group therapies. The therapeutic garden had been designed by a specialized landscape architect, with water features, shaded areas, strategically placed benches, and plants chosen for their calming properties and therapeutic aromas. Edward had invested not only in physical structure, but also in technology. State-of-the-art ambient sound systems that allowed for personalized sound atmospheres for each type of treatment, smart lighting that automatically adjusted to the needs of each session, even a small laboratory where they could develop their own essential oils and therapeutic products in the future. Marina began assembling her team. She interviewed dozens of therapists, seeking not only technical competence but primarily alignment of values. She wanted people who genuinely cared about patients' well-being, who saw the profession as a vocation and not just a job. She brought Felicity, her former colleague from Harmony Clinic, to be the resident acupuncturist. She hired an exceptional physiotherapist named Richard, who worked with emotional release techniques through movement, a psychologist named Beatrice, specializing in trauma, who used EMDR and other innovative approaches, a yoga and meditation instructor named Andrew, who had a serene and inspiring presence. The team came together naturally, as if they were all destined to work together. Edward created an organizational culture based on collaboration, where each therapist was encouraged to develop their own approach within a common framework of integral care. There were weekly meetings where everyone shared challenging cases, asked each other for suggestions, and learned together. Marina developed an intensive training program for new therapists who wanted to learn her vocal resonance technique. She couldn't teach auditory synesthesia, of course, but she could teach the principles of verbal guidance, intentional voice use, and deep therapeutic presence. The first group of students was small, just 5 carefully selected therapists. The training lasted 3 months and was rigorous, demanding not only technical learning but also deep personal work. Marina believed that no one could heal others without first healing their own wounds. During this period of intense activity, the relationship between Marina and Edward subtly transformed. They spent hours together every day, discussing institute decisions, solving problems, planning the future. There was an ease between them, a mutual understanding that transcended many words. Sometimes a glance was enough to know what the other was thinking. Edward began to realize he felt something more for Marina. It wasn't just admiration or friendship. There was a growing attraction, a desire for closeness that went beyond the professional. But he felt guilty about these feelings. He thought he was betraying his wife's memory, that it was too soon, that Marina probably didn't feel the same way. He tried to suppress these feelings, keeping everything strictly professional. Marina, in turn, was also confused about what she felt. She had immense affection for Edward, a deep gratitude for everything he had done for her. But there was something more, something that made her anxious on days they were going to meet, that made her choose her clothes more carefully, that made her feel a strange pang when she saw Edward talking to other women at events. She tried to convince herself it was just friendship, that it would be absurd to imagine anything else. They were from completely different worlds, had incompatible stories, and moreover, they were partners. It would be too complicated. Mrs. Celia, observing everything from afar, perfectly perceived what was happening. She knew her daughter too well not to notice the subtle changes. She saw the different sparkle in her eyes when she spoke of Edward, the way she worried about him, how she unconsciously cared for him. And she saw Edward in the same way, the protective manner in which he treated Marina, the attention he dedicated to every detail that might please her. Mrs. Celia smiled to herself, praying that the two would have the courage to admit what they felt, but she didn't interfere. She knew that some things needed to happen at the right time. The inauguration of the Harmony Institute was scheduled for a spring Friday. Edward had planned a discreet but elegant event, inviting influential people from the corporate world and the health sector. The objective was to present the institute, showcase its structure, and explain its work philosophy. Marina was nervous about the exposure, but Edward assured her he would be by her side the entire time. In the week leading up to the inauguration, something unexpected happened. Marina was at home, organizing her materials for the event, when she received a call from an unknown number. It was a woman who identified herself as a journalist from a major health and wellness magazine. She said she had read the scientific article about the therapeutic synesthesia case, had discovered that Marina was the person in the study, and wanted to do a cover story about her and the Harmony Institute. Marina didn't know how to respond. On one hand, it was an incredible publicity opportunity. On the other, she was afraid of the exposure, that things would get out of control as they had with the viral video. She asked for time to think and immediately called Edward. They discussed the pros and cons for hours. Edward argued that this time it would be different, that they would have control over the narrative, that the journalist was respected and serious, but that the final decision was Marina's. Marina decided to accept on the condition that Edward also participate in the interview, speaking about the Institute's vision and his own healing journey. The journalist agreed, and they scheduled it for the next day. The interview was long and profound. The journalist asked intelligent questions, wanting to understand not only the therapeutic method, but also the people behind it. Marina spoke openly about her childhood, about Mrs. Celia, about discovering her gift. Edward shared his story of loss and reconstruction, and both spoke about how they met almost magically, about the connection to the past through Mrs. Celia. When the article came out 2 weeks later, it was even better than they expected. The magazine had done an exceptional job of reporting, telling the story in a sensitive and inspiring way. There were beautiful photos of the Institute, testimonials from patients who had already been treated in pilot tests, scientific explanations about Marina's synesthesia. The cover featured a photo of the two of them, Marina and Edward, side by side in the therapeutic garden, with the title, "When Science Meets the Heart, the New Frontier of Holistic Healing." The repercussion was immediate and overwhelming. The Institute's phone didn't stop ringing with appointment requests. Companies wanted partnerships. Universities wanted to establish joint research programs. Other health professionals wanted to learn about the work, to learn the technique. It was exactly the kind of recognition Marina always deserved, but never dared to dream she would have. The Institute's inauguration was an absolute success. More than 200 people attended. The event began with a presentation by Edward explaining the mission and values of the Harmony Institute. He spoke passionately about the importance of treating the human being in an integral way, about how his own healing had depended on something that went far beyond conventional medical techniques. He spoke about the Institute's commitment to accessibility, announcing that 20% of the slots would always be dedicated to free care for low-income individuals. Marina presented next, explaining the therapeutic philosophy and the different modalities offered. Her voice was firm and clear, very different from the shy woman she had been a few months ago. She had found not only her professional voice, but also her personal voice, her ability to position herself and lead. The guests listened fascinated, many taking notes, some clearly moved by the story being told. After the formal presentations, there was a guided tour of the facilities. People marveled at the beauty and attention to detail. There was live music in the garden, a string quartet playing soft compositions, buffet service with light and healthy food. It was an event that perfectly reflected the spirit of the Institute, elegant yet accessible, sophisticated yet welcoming. In a moment of pause, Marina and Edward found themselves alone in the garden, a little away from the crowd. They stood near the water fountain, watching people circulate, when Edward said something he had been holding on to for weeks. "You know, none of this would have happened without you. Not just the Institute. I wouldn't be here, whole, truly alive, if you hadn't appeared in my life." Marina looked at him, saw the sincerity in his grey eyes, felt her heart quicken. She replied with the same honesty, "And I wouldn't be here, in this place, being who I always wanted to be if you hadn't believed in me when I didn't. I even believe in myself. We saved each other." There was a moment of intense silence between them, a moment where everything could have changed, where one of them could have taken the next step, closed the physical distance separating them. But neither of them had the courage. Fear was still greater than certainty. So Edward smiled, a somewhat sad smile, and said they needed to return to the guests. Marina agreed, and they walked back together, side by side but without touching, carrying that unlived moment as a sweet and melancholic weight. The following months were filled with intense work. The Harmony Institute quickly established itself as a benchmark. Patients came from all over the country, some even from outside the UK, seeking the treatments offered there. Marina was constantly in sessions, training new therapists, supervising complex cases. Edward handled management, finances, and strategic partnerships. They worked in perfect harmony, complementing each other naturally. But something began to change. Perhaps it was accumulated fatigue. Perhaps it was the unresolved tension between them. Perhaps it was simply life taking its toll. Edward began to have relapses. The shoulder pains returned occasionally. Sleepless nights returned. He tried to hide it, not wanting to worry Marina, who already had so much to deal with. But she noticed, of course. Her ability to read people was too keen not to. One night, after everyone had left and the institute was empty, Marina found Edward alone in his office, massaging his right shoulder with an expression of pain. She entered without asking permission, closed the door, and said firmly, "I need to work on you, now." Edward tried to refuse, said he was fine, that it was just a little tension. But Marina wouldn't accept it. "You've gone back to your old patterns. You're locking yourself up again, keeping everything inside. And your body is responding the way it always does when you do that. Come with me." She led him to one of the therapy rooms, the same one where they used to have sessions back at the clinic. Edward lay on the massage table reluctantly, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Marina began her work, but this time there was something different in her touch. There was an urgency, a need to reach him that went beyond the professional. She began to speak, with that voice he knew so well, but the words were different. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as she worked on the tension knots in his shoulder. "Why are you punishing yourself again? You have a right to be happy, Edward. You have a right to live fully. Your wife gave you permission, remember? So why do you keep denying yourself?" Edward kept his eyes closed, feeling tears begin to form. "Because I'm scared," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Scared to open up again and lose everything again. Scared to build something and watch it crumble. Scared to feel and suffer. It's easier to stay in limbo, neither completely alive nor completely dead." Marina's hands paused for a moment. She leaned in closer to his face and said with an intensity he had never heard from her, "But you're not in limbo. You are here. I am here. Life is happening now, in this moment, in this place. And you can choose to live or you can choose just to exist. But know that if you choose merely to exist, you will be wasting the most precious gift you've ever been given. A second chance." Edward opened his eyes and met her dark eyes just inches from his own. And in that moment all defenses fell. All fears, all excuses, all logical reasons why this shouldn't happen simply vanished. He raised his hand and gently touched her face. Marina closed her eyes at his touch, leaning slightly into his hand. "I'm in love with you," Edward said, his voice just a whisper. "I think I have been since that first day, when I heard your voice in the corridor. I tried to deny it, tried to hide it, but I can't anymore. You brought me back to life, and now I don't know how to live without you." Marina felt tears begin to stream down her face. She opened her eyes and looked at him with a vulnerability she rarely showed. "Me too," she replied. "I love you too. And that scares me so much because everything could go wrong. We could ruin everything we've built. But I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore." Edward sat up on the massage table, bringing himself to her level. He wiped the tears from Marina's face with his thumb, and then, finally, after months of unresolved tension, he kissed her. It was a soft, respectful kiss filled with all the feelings that had been held back for so long. Marina responded to the kiss, allowing herself to feel everything she had been repressing, all the attraction, all the affection, all the love that had grown silently. When they separated, they remained there, embracing in the dark, silent room, feeling their hearts race, knowing that something fundamental had changed between them, also knowing that they would have to deal with the consequences of this change, with the complexity of mixing personal and professional lives, with the opinions of others, with their own fears. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they had finally admitted the truth to themselves and to each other. News of Marina and Edward's relationship didn't take long to spread among the Harmony Institute staff. They tried to be discreet at first, but there was a new intimacy between them that was impossible to completely hide. Their gazes lingered longer, smiles were more frequent. There was a lightness in the air when they were together. Felicity was the first to notice, and with her characteristic delicacy, pulled Marina aside during a break one day to ask if everything was all right. Marina hesitated, but decided to be honest with her friend. She told her about what had happened, about the feelings they had been holding back that had finally been admitted. She perhaps expected judgment, a concern about mixing personal and professional lives. But Felicity just smiled and hugged her, saying that anyone with eyes could see they were made for each other, that true love was too rare to be wasted on social conventions. The entire team reacted similarly. There was genuine happiness for both of them. Edward was respected as a leader and employer, but also well-liked for the human way he treated everyone. And Marina was loved for her dedication, generosity, and welcoming presence. Seeing them together seemed natural, as if the universe had finally put things in their rightful places. Mrs. Celia, when she found out, simply gave that wise smile of someone who had always known it would happen. She hugged her daughter and said her only concern was that Marina wouldn't let the fear of loss prevent her from loving completely. That life didn't come with guarantees, that there would always be risk, but that living in fear was worse than any possible loss. Marina kept those words in her heart, knowing that her mother spoke from her own experience, having loved and lost Marina's father young, but never regretting having loved. Edward and Marina decided they wouldn't hide their relationship, but also wouldn't make a public spectacle of it. It was something intimate, precious, that deserved to be protected from others' curiosity. At the Institute, they maintained their usual professionalism. In meetings, administrative decisions, interactions with patients, they were partners and colleagues. It was only in private moments, when the doors closed and the world remained outside, that they allowed their love to flourish freely. Edward proposed that Marina move into the mansion with Mrs. Celia. There was plenty of space, and it made logistical sense since Marina spent most of her days there anyway. Marina was torn. On one hand, it would be much more practical. On the other, she felt things were moving too fast, that she needed to preserve some independence. Edward understood perfectly and didn't pressure her. He said the house was there, whenever she wanted it, but that he would respect any decision she made. Marina eventually accepted, but with one condition: that she also keep the house in Penfield as her own space, a place where she could return when she needed solitude, or simply to reconnect with her roots. Edward agreed without hesitation, and even offered to help renovate the house to make it more comfortable. Marina accepted this help, knowing that he offered it out of genuine generosity, not wanting to control or change who she was. The move happened on a sunny Saturday. Friends helped transport Mrs. Celia's and Marina's belongings. It was a stark difference, moving from the simple 3-story house in Penfield to the mansion in Kensington Gardens. But Edward did everything to make them feel at home. Gave Mrs. Celia a ground-floor suite, with easy access to the garden, fully adapted to her needs. Marina took a suite on the 2nd floor, close but separate from Edward's suite, respecting the fact that they were still in the early stages of their relationship. Mrs. Celia adapted surprisingly well. She loved the therapeutic garden, spending hours sitting there, watching the birds, feeling the sun on her face. Edward hired a nurse to help with daily care, but Mrs. Celia had increasingly better days. It was as if being in that healing environment, surrounded by positive energies and love, had a regenerating effect on her. Doctors were impressed with the improvement in her tests, with the reduction in the need for medications. The Harmony Institute continued to grow. Demand was so great that they had to expand, hiring more therapists, opening new rooms. Marina developed a supervision system where more experienced therapists mentored newer ones, ensuring that the quality of care remained high. She herself continued to see patients directly, especially the more complex cases that required her unique ability. It was through one of these cases that something extraordinary happened. A patient named Robert arrived at the Institute with a particularly difficult history. He had suffered a severe car accident that left deep physical and emotional sequelae. He had chronic pains that no conventional treatment could relieve, in addition to recurrent nightmares and anxiety attacks. Doctors had basically given up on him, saying he would have to learn to live with those conditions. Marina accepted the case, knowing it would be challenging. She started with weekly sessions, using her full therapeutic arsenal. The initial response was slow. Robert was so locked down, so emotionally closed, that it seemed impossible to reach him. But Marina didn't give up easily. She adjusted her approach with each session, experimented with different vocal frequencies, different touch techniques, always listening attentively to that internal sound that only she could perceive. It was in the 5th session that the breakthrough happened. Marina was working on Robert's lower back when she heard a different sound. It wasn't just physical pain, it was something deeper, older. It was the sound of unprocessed trauma, of a visceral fear that had settled in the body. She began to modulate her voice in a very specific way, creating a frequency that she intuitively knew could neutralize that dissonant sound. Robert began to tremble. It wasn't a tremor of cold or conscious fear, it was something deeper, as if his body was finally releasing something that had been trapped for a long time. And then he began to speak, not to Marina, but as if he were speaking to someone invisible. He began to describe the accident in vivid detail, reliving that traumatic moment. Marina continued her work, continued using her voice as an anchor, allowing Robert to move through that memory safely. When the session ended, Robert was exhausted but different. There was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He said it was as if a dense cloud that had covered his mind for years had finally dissipated. The subsequent sessions were for consolidation, working on the more superficial layers now that the core of the trauma had been accessed. In 3 months, Robert was practically free from chronic pain. The nightmares had stopped. He returned to work, to relate with his family, to live. Robert's case was not unique, but it was particularly impactful. Edward suggested they systematically document cases like this, not only for scientific purposes, but also to show the world what was possible when healing was approached in a truly holistic way. Marina agreed, and they began to develop a research protocol in partnership with universities. Dr. Paul Marshall became involved again, now not only studying Marina's brain, but also studying the clinical results of the treatments offered at the institute. The data was impressive. Rates of significant improvement far surpassed conventional treatments, especially in cases of chronic pain, trauma, and psychosomatic conditions. The work began to be presented at international conferences, attracting attention from researchers and health professionals worldwide. With all this success, challenges also arose. There were professionals who questioned the legitimacy of the work, calling it pseudoscience, demanding more controlled studies. Marina learned to deal with criticism, to separate the constructive ones from those that were merely unfounded skepticism. Edward always supported her, reminding her that innovation always met resistance, that the important thing was to maintain the integrity of the work and let the results speak for themselves. There was also the challenge of maintaining the balance between growth and the Institute's essence. They constantly received offers from investors wanting to expand the business, turn it into a franchise, take the model to other cities. Marina was resistant to this. She was afraid that uncontrolled expansion would compromise quality, transforming something genuine into just another business. Edward, with his business experience, helped find a middle ground. They did expand, but in a controlled manner and always maintaining the core values. They opened a second Harmony Institute branch in another region of London, and a third in Edinburgh. Each branch had a coordinator personally trained by Marina, someone who deeply understood the philosophy of the work. Marina traveled regularly to supervise, ensuring that the standard was being maintained. It was tiring, but also gratifying to see the reach of their work multiplying. Amidst all this professional bustle, Marina and Edward's personal life deepened. They found their own rhythm, a way of being together that respected each other's individuality, but also celebrated their union. They had simple yet meaningful rituals. They dined together every night when possible, always without phones at the table, dedicating that time just to talk about their day, about dreams, about nothing and everything. On Sundays, they took walks in Hyde Park, observing people, dogs, children, reminding themselves that simple life also had its beauty. Edward began to rediscover himself through his relationship with Marina. He returned to doing things he had abandoned years ago. He started playing the piano again, something he loved in his youth but had set aside. Marina loved to sit near the piano and listen to him play, closing her eyes and letting the music envelop her. He composed a piece for her, something soft and melancholic but full of hope, which he played whenever he noticed she was tense or worried. Marina, in turn, began to allow herself to dream bigger. She started writing a book about her journey and her therapeutic method. It was something she had never considered before, but Edward encouraged her, saying that her story and knowledge needed to be shared more widely. She wrote late at night when the world was silent, letting the words flow naturally. The book was not only technical, but also personal, intertwining her life story with the therapeutic principles she had developed. A year after they made their relationship official, Edward made a formal marriage proposal. It wasn't grand or public, it was intimate and deeply meaningful. He took Marina to that room that had been his daughter's, the place where he had finally made peace with the past. He said he wanted her to understand that his daughter and his wife would always have a place in his heart, but that this in no way diminished the love he felt for her. That love was not a pie where a slice for one person meant less for another. That the human heart had an infinite capacity to love, and that she had expanded his in ways he didn't even know were possible. Marina cried, as she always did when deep emotions overcame her. She said yes without hesitation, knowing that she was saying yes, not just to a marriage but to a life partnership, to continue building something greater than themselves together. The wedding was simple, held in the Institute's therapeutic garden, with only close family and the most intimate friends. Mrs. Celia was there, radiant, with surprisingly good health that day, as if joy itself had healing powers. Life followed its natural course after that. The Harmony Institute continued to grow and evolve. Marina published her book, which became a bestseller and was translated into several languages. Edward expanded his human development programs, integrating many of the principles he had learned from Marina. They became benchmarks, not only in their specific fields, but also as an example of how it was possible to build something meaningful when purpose and love aligned. There were, of course, challenges along the way, moments of disagreement, tension, doubt. Not everything was perfect, because real life never is. But they had learned something fundamental through their individual and now shared journeys, that healing was not a destination, but a continuous process, that growth required discomfort, that true love was not the absence of problems but presence in the midst of them. Marina continued to develop her unique ability. Over time, she realized that she could not only hear people's bodies, but also teach others to listen to their own bodies. Not in the same synesthetic way she experienced it, but through cultivated attention, developed sensitivity. This became a central part of her training method, this idea that we can all learn to listen to the messages our bodies constantly send us. Edward, for his part, discovered that his own healing journey had transformed him into a better, more empathetic, more human leader. He applied these lessons in his company, creating a work environment that valued vulnerability, authenticity, and personal growth. His company became known not only for its results, but for the organizational culture that promoted genuine well-being. Mrs. Celia lived 7 more years after her daughter's wedding, years of quality that no one had predicted she would have. She saw Marina happy, fulfilled, making a difference in the world. She saw the Institute prospering, lives being transformed. And when her time came to depart, it was in peace, sleeping soundly in the garden she loved so much, with the afternoon sun warming her face. Marina mourned her loss, of course, but not with despair. She mourned with gratitude for having had that extraordinary woman as a mother, for having learned from her everything that truly mattered about caring, about loving, about being human. Mrs. Celia's death had a profound yet transformative impact on Marina. She viscerally understood something she had always known intellectually, that life was finite and precious, that there was no time to waste on fear or pettiness. She began to live with even greater intensity, to embrace every moment, to say, "I love you," more frequently, to take more risks in her art of healing. 5 years after Mrs. Celia's passing, Marina and Edward were sitting in the Same garden where she had spent her last happy moments. It was a Saturday afternoon, and they had decided to take the day off, something rare in their intense routines. They were just there, in comfortable silence. When Edward commented on how everything had changed since that day, he heard a phrase out of context in a clinic corridor. Marina laughed, remembering that moment and how distant it seemed now. She said that sometimes life had a strange sense of humor, using misunderstandings and impossible coincidences to put people where they needed to be. That if she had known that, to everything that would happen starting from that silly phrase, she probably wouldn't have believed it. Edward agreed, and then said something that would echo in Marina for a long time. You know what the most extraordinary thing about this whole story is? It's not the Institute's success, it's not the professional recognition, it's not even the love we found. It's the fact that it all began with two deeply wounded people who had the courage to allow themselves to care and be cared for, who chose to believe that healing was possible when everyone else said it wasn't. That is the true miracle. Marina looked at him and saw no longer the shattered man she had met years ago, but someone whole, alive, radiant, and she knew he saw the same transformation in her. They had saved each other, yes, but more than that, they had learned to save themselves, and then they had dedicated their lives to helping others do the same. The Harmony Institute was no longer just a physical place. It had become a movement, a philosophy of life that spread through the people who passed through its doors. Each healed patient became a messenger, carrying to the world the idea that true healing was possible, that suffering didn't have to be permanent, that there was always hope, even in the darkest moments. Marina looked around the garden, seeing the flowers her mother loved so much, hearing the water fountain Edward had installed with her in mind, feeling the warmth of the sun and the presence of the man she loved by her side. And she felt a deep peace, the kind of peace that only comes when you know you are exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you should be doing, she thought. Of all the people she had helped over the years, all the lives that had